So for our next session, we were supposed to have a third panelist join us, but unfortunately Therese Brown from the Association of Catholic Publishers fell ill with the flu, so she could not be with us today. However, we are still lucky enough to be joined by Louis Simpson from AAP and Angela Bole from IBPA. So we're going to talk a little bit about their membership because, it was great hearing from Brian, and he was able to give us perspective from one of the large publishers. But these two ladies and their associations represent a much larger swath of the publishing community. So we're going to talk a little bit about how they kind of see things. So I'm going to let you guys kind of give a quick introduction of yourselves and who are your members of that group. So Louis, do you want to go first?
Am I on?
Yep.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Louis Simpson. I'm with the Association of American Publishers, where I manage our global policy and enforcement advocacy as well as actions on behalf of our members. So as Matt mentioned, AAP actually represents three distinct sectors of the publishing industry. Of course, Brian spoke to us this morning about the trade or consumer sector of the industry. We also represent education publishers, so those are the publishers of elementary, secondary, and higher education textbooks and professional books. And then, of course, the professional and scholarly publishers, also known as the scientific, technical, and medical publishing sector.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Angela Bole. I'm kind of the CEO of the Independent Book Publishers Association. I was replaced about 3 days ago by a new CEO who's coming in, and I'm going to be moving to an organization called the Firebrand Group next February, if you know the Firebrand Group. They do all of the title management software for book publishers. But I'm still here. I still have a little bit of time, and I have spent about almost 9 years at IBPA. IBPA is the Independent Book Publishers Association. It is the Wild West of book publishing, I think. We represent over 4,000 book publishers, from the one book author publisher who's just trying to get that memoir out or get that family story published, all the way up to some of the larger indie publishers like Source Books and Lerner, Llewellyn. They're also members of IBPA. So yeah, if it's small press, we represent them. We do not discriminate against business models, so we'll have publishers, again, who are self-published, who are hybrid, who are service providers, and again, who are very, very traditional in their business.
Great. Well, we thank Angela. This is one of her last duties for IBPA, is representing them here. And if you didn't see the announcement, the new CEO of IBPA will be Andrea Fleck-Nesbitt, who, if you remember, has been a speaker at BMI events as well. So we're lucky to keep the good relationship going with IBPA. But thank you for being here, Angela and Louis. So, Brian talked about kind of the trade market trends, Amazon, retail, independent bookstores, all that. So based on what you heard him say, how does that track with what your members are seeing kind of in the same vein? Angela, do you want to?
Yeah, I thought we love to talk about Amazon. It's great. So I was interested in the frenemy aspect of talking about Amazon, and I would say for our membership, it's a little emphasis on the friend, a little bit of the me, but really the Amazon exists. Therefore, independent publishing at the level that we work with independent publishers exists. Without Amazon coming into the market and providing an opportunity for all of these other people to have a voice in the industry, some other player might have come up and done that, but since they were the one to do it, we give credit where credit was due. Kindle launched in 2007. At that point, really, you just had your big 5, 6 publishers, I guess at the time. You had your big 6 publishers, and they were saturated the market. Since 2007 and coming up to today, I think Baehr, which does ISBNs, as you know, or maybe not, but they put the ISBNs out in the industry. They are saying that 1.5 million self-published books are out every year, and 1.2-ish of those come through Amazon. So they're really pushing a lot of content up into the market for ill in some cases. Sometimes it's not very good. So we have to contend with what a big flood of content will do to a marketplace. But nonetheless, it's a lot of content, and some of it is very, very good. And when we talk about other aspects of the publishing industry, like diversity, equity, and inclusion, this space is really where a lot of that energy has come through because the doors have often been shut for them and the larger players. So there have been a lot of things that are interesting about the markets. The brick and mortars traditionally shut down to indie publishers because, again, it's already saturated and they don't generally have traditional distribution so they can get into those spaces. So online sales is a sweet spot if you are publishing, you know, at this level. And so the direct-to-consumer marketing is a place where I think they've started to excel because of that. So there's a lot to talk about Amazon, but, you know, they do some, we don't love everything they do. We wish they would have adopted the 979 ISBNs. There's a lot of different things. They stay way behind publishing industry trends, but at least they created a space for there to be more players and more voices.
Louis, what do you?
I guess I'll talk a little bit about the supply chain issues for education publishers. My understanding is that the same issues that plague others, well, certainly the trade sector also plague some of the publishers in the education sector. And of course, I think it has to do with the quality or the nature of the paper that they require for their books and the standards that have to be met with respect to books that have to be published in that space. With respect to professional and scholarly publishers, given that much of their product is now digital, the supply chain issues with respect to print, you know, paper and freight and things like that don't affect them likely as much. But I do think Brian's point about bringing much of what we can back to the U.S. might be helpful in sort of onshoring some of the things that you do in your sector. He mentioned China a little. I think you all might be familiar with the Section 301 investigation that resulted in the imposition of tariffs on all products coming out of China. And unfortunately, books were part of those products that are subject to increased tariff rates coming in at the U.S. borders. There were, of course, exemptions for religious books coming into the U.S. out of China, as well as children's books, but that didn't really, I think, make a dent in the market. And certainly the last administration had a severe misunderstanding, to put it mildly, of the nature of the tariffs that they were imposing with respect to books coming out of China. I realize that, of course, it would be much better if things were onshored in the US, but as one of you pointed out, it does require a significant investment in that space before we can take on or bring back to capacity, I guess, the level of printing and manufacturing that is required in terms of the demand in the US publishing industry. Now, turning to Amazon, there's really not much more to say about the nature of the relationship between and among publishers with respect to Amazon. It is an entity that all publishers have to deal with. It's there. They do, unfortunately, occupy a significant space in that sector, and you can't really do business, I guess, without Amazon being part of your equation. But Brian's point about it being so big, and there does have to be certain limits to it, I think is something that the entire industry is grappling with. AAP is the advocacy organization for publishers. In general, we've been interacting, of course, with the various government agencies. We've been participating in inquiries with respect to the process put together by the Federal Trade Commission as well as Congress into how the government can do a better job in terms of policing these dominant platforms and the practices that they do employ with respect to how and who has access to the services that they do provide. Because of course you're all very familiar with the term is, I'm forgetting the term, but in terms of who can access that platform and how, I think is very important with respect to, as Angela mentioned, indie publishers, but certainly the control with which Amazon exercises how you can make or avail yourself of the services that they do provide is certainly a question that we've put forward to policymakers.
So, Louis, you mentioned the scholarly publishing and education markets. You know, a lot of what Brian talked about is obviously on the trade side. So, what have your members seen kind of as the trends going forward with both the ed markets, whether that's K-12, higher ed, or the scholarly publishing arena?
Well, I guess I don't know if it's appropriate to speak of it in this space, but unfortunately, piracy remains a significant concern for those two sectors. And digital piracy is something that the industry has contended with for quite some time now, and it's certainly not gotten any better in terms of what you as a rights holder can do in the US market. Unfortunately, our framework is not one that is conducive to being very helpful to publishers in terms of addressing the, frankly, rampant nature of online piracy today. So for the scholarly publishers, there is one site that does not just hosting in terms of making infringing material available, but frankly, it also engages in, frankly, illegal activity in terms of hacking into systems so that they can harvest volumes and volumes of journal articles and then posting it on their own servers to make it available for free. And obviously, publishers invest not just in the production and editing of these articles, but in the infrastructure that makes these articles accessible to researchers, to students, and to, of course, faculty at universities. And it's the same for education publishers. They face the same problem. And again, the system that we do have in the US in terms of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is frankly way overdue in terms of requiring reform and updating, but that has been stalled many times in Congress, and we've frankly not been very successful in terms of moving that needle forward so that we do have the environment in which rights holders can better and more effectively address the nature of online piracy. And I think in the, I guess in the elementary and secondary education markets, there is of course the political environment that affects that, and we have all these discussions about parents objecting to what may be taught in schools, and it does bring to, I mean, if you're a parent, you obviously have a responsibility to look at what your child or your children are reading and what they're studying, but at the end of the day, there are expert educators, curriculum developers out there. So putting your, I guess as a parent, in that space, I don't know, I think it's a very hard market for education publishers to tread now in terms of, are we satisfying the curriculum, or do we also have to contend with certain forces that do not necessarily take an open mind with respect to the availability of material for children?
So Angela, earlier, Louis mentioned supply chain, and Brian obviously talked a lot about labor and paper availability and that kind of thing. So how are your members dealing with the supply chain issues, whether that be paper or even the overseas printing or anything like that?
Yeah, I was thinking about how to talk about supply chain from a small press. I mean, I'll mention again, we do have larger presses, but I think Louis can talk better in that space. But if you're talking about small press, you're talking about print on demand. So supply chain issues in that space, it feels weird to say, but it didn't hit so hard there because that was still available to them. In 2013, when Ingram Spark, and I think everybody here would understand what Ingram Spark is able to do for small presses, but when they launched in 2013, they really changed the game for entry for presses that wanted to either start or just didn't have any money, or wherever they were, because they had access to distribution channels. And that's one thing that I really haven't seen kind of blossom, and you guys will explain to me why we haven't seen more of that happen with the POD printers that are also out there in the space, because we do need more competition there for sure. We need other places for upstart publishers and publishers that want to build businesses to come into, because they won't have the capital to do large offsets, and they won't have traditional distribution to get their content into the market. I'm not even going to pretend like they even want to get into bricks and mortar. They won't have the distribution to get it to online sales channels either, and they need that. And so right now they only get that through Ingram Spark, or they go direct through KDP with Kindle Direct Publishing through Amazon. So the channels are very small. So related to supply chain issues, Ingram said this when we toured, and they will always say it, they never ran out of paper. They have enough pull in the industry that they just stacked paper. They said they got down to like one roll, like that were kind of building the suspense. We got down to one roll, and then they got it done. So, it just didn't hit in that way as far as the supply chain issues there. And these are not publishers that are printing overseas, so they really are looking for domestic partners. But again, they need to find that access to at least some sense of wholesale distribution if they're going to be successful. What they did experience were prices going up, as we all did. Everything in my life is more expensive right now. And paper definitely went up. And that's kind of a, well, I wanted to say a tragic issue, but I need to step myself back. It's okay. But it was for them because the fact of POD prices, and then the fact that the larger publishers actually are the ones that are setting the list price for content, smaller publishers have to follow their lead. They get to set it, but they're setting their list prices off of offset print runs and what it costs to print books in that way. And then the indie publishers are following suit, or they have to follow suit in order to stay competitive in the space. So when the prices go up that high on POD, it knocks them out of it knocks them out of any profit at all, really, if they're going to print POD. And they need time to get up to capacity to become offset publishers. So.
Okay. Well, looking at supply chain and the fact that COVID really drove a surge in physical book sales, and you guys both mentioned it a little bit, but how are your publishers looking at making those decisions between digital books and the print side of things? What their focuses are, how they decide to print, how many to print, anything between digital and physical. I don't know who wants to take a stab at that first.
They want print books. I mean, I don't think they would pay what they would call exorbitant PODs up front.
Good change.
What they would call the high prices if they didn't want to have print content in the marketplace. But a lot of the genres are strictly digital and happy to be so, and are printing or aren't printing at all. And they can be very successful that way. I was just on a panel with an author that I think she said she wrote 10 books a year, and it was crazy to me, all in the romance genre, the Christian romance genre. And yeah, she does everything digital, everything goes out that way because that's where her readers are. So a lot of the indie authors are going strictly digital, but the ones that want print, they definitely want that aspect as well. At IBPA, we say you should have your book available in every format that it can be available. I think that might not be great advice, though, for some people. I think you should have your book available in whatever format the consumers want that particular piece of content in, generally speaking, so. Yeah.
I can't really speak to, I guess, the publisher decisions on this question, but when, of course, the pandemic hit, much of certainly education publishers had already made significant inroads in terms of digital distribution for textbooks. And we certainly saw that increase during the pandemic. And I think it's sort of it is a hybrid for many education publishers. You'll still have your physical textbooks, but many of the what do you call them, supplemental educational instructional materials, those are all digital. And there are advances in that or advantages to that because it allows a professor or a teacher to tailor or monitor the child's progress and tailor specific educational supplements to the child because it is answering the child's particular needs. So I think for many education publishers, it continues to be very much a hybrid framework where you will have the physical textbooks because that is still what is, I think, many students still gravitate to, but there will, of course, always be a digital component. And then the question of educational costs is very much, of course, top of mind given everything that has increased in price. And our publishers in the education space have put forward what is called inclusive access, where from day one, many of the materials are already accessible through digital means, and I think that has resulted in a lot of cost savings for students, which is always helpful given that I think many of you are aware that publishers are always vilified in terms of the cost of textbooks without, of course, the general public understanding that it's not just the mere physical printing and manufacturing of the book. There is, of course, the intellectual capital that goes into the development of the curriculum, in the editing, et cetera, that many, I think, consumers are not quite aware of. In the STM space, for the most part, much of the delivery is already digital. So I don't know how much of the equation factors in terms of hard goods or print, but there is certainly a greater move to digital works. But as Brian said, I don't think the appetite for physical books will ever wane. I think we'll always want to have physical books, and certainly in my personal experience, I mean, I have audiobooks and I have ebooks. And for the books that I really like, I'll go out and buy the physical copy. And then I'll read it again because there's something that you miss when it's just the ebook. Underlining certain passages doesn't work so well in the digital format.
Yeah, I was thinking, I mentioned to Matt when I was walking up here that I took the job at IBPA in 2013, and one of my first gigs was to come to a BMI conference, and one of my last now, so little bookend moments for everybody. And what I did at that conference was talk about a report that I did at the Book Industry Study Group called Consumer Attitudes Toward eBook Reading, which was launched with the concept in mind that that ebooks were going to cannibalize the heck out of the print book industry, and we were not going to have a print book industry anymore. So let's do some research and figure out exactly how much. Which is not the right way to do research, which is to come in with an idea of exactly what you think is going to happen and then try to prove it. But everybody in the industry at the time felt that way very strongly, 2013. So I came to BMI and we talked about the data, and even at that time I was saying the ebook market is 20-25%. Ebook sales are 20-25% of the overall market. And today I can say to you that ebook sales are 25 to 30% of the market. So ebooks did not come in and completely cannibalize the print book market. As much as publishers want to create print content, readers want to ingest it. The thing that is coming in now that we saw during the pandemic are the audiobooks. That I do think is a different kind of digital content that could have a little bit more play in this space and could make a bit of a difference, because it is a different experience to ingest audio than it is to ingest digital. Because if you're doing, I'm explaining how reading works. So when you read, you're sitting there, and if you have a print book, you're sitting there, and if you have a digital book, you're sitting there. You're not also cooking or walking or cleaning your house or doing something else, multitasking, which you can absolutely do with an audiobook, and which all of us have done through the pandemic because we could not leave our four walls. So I think now who's going to run the, what did we call it, the consumer attitudes toward ebook reading from 2013. We need the consumer attitudes toward audiobook listening report that will tell us, and then kind of on and on. That format feels a little different than the ebook format does.
If I could just bring in a little bit of policy, and I think with respect to audiobooks and all things digital, we do have to be aware of and a little bit concerned, I suppose, with the increasing use of artificial intelligence, because there you do have AI factoring in terms of what it can do and what it will be able to do. So you have these programs like, it's called Dali, and if you're interested, you can sign up and you can plug in something like create a soccer game in the style of Dali with the mustache. And it will create a painting for you, of course digital, that mimics Dali's style, but it is specific to the words that you said. And in the audiobook world, will we have technology where artificial intelligence is so sophisticated that you can say, in terms of, I guess, an ebook, read this book in the style of, I don't know, who has a distinct voice?
James Earl Jones.
Sorry.
James Earl Jones.
Oh, James Earl Jones, right. So it'll be the father of Luke Skywalker reading that book to you. The problem there, of course, is you are robbing the actor of his performance rights, and then it raises a lot more questions about so-called deep fakes. And these are things that we worry about in the industry because, as Angela mentioned, if you as the author and publisher, you just get to decide the formats in which you will make your work available. But if these technologies become so advanced that they then rob you of your ability to parse out your rights so you can sell into the ebook market, into the audiobook market, into the print market, that then becomes severely problematic for publishers and how you continue to protect and enforce your copyright in these different formats. So it's going to be, I think we are already living in the times of that Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, and we're definitely there, I think, in terms of technology development.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, Angela, maybe you just gave me an idea of what our 2023 research project might be around.
Awesome.
But I will take the opportunity, though, to plug our 2021 research, in case you haven't seen it, around parent preferences in print in the K-12 marketplace. So we did a whole lot of surveys and interviews and things of that nature around print preference for the K-12 market in parents. And so that stuff's available on the BMI website if you haven't seen it. It's good stuff. But anyway. Well, let's shift gears a little bit. One of the things that was mentioned was earlier with Brian was sustainability. And it cuts across so many things now. So Brian kind of answered the question in his eyes, but how do your members see the importance of sustainability, and where do you see their focus being on any of those fronts, sustainability-wise? Angela?
Small presses are so beholden to their trading partners. So where they would like to see it is further along. Where they see it is exactly where Ingram has put it, to be fair, in terms of their POD. And there are petitions, and Ingram continues to say that they'll do it when we get enough people that are interested in it, but it's an expense for us and there's not enough people that are interested in it, and it's a circle that kind of goes around. So our former board chair, his name is Carla Olson, and she works for Patagonia. Books, which is the clothing company, but they also make beautiful print books and digital. So she's been our kind of sustainability czar, and she has worked on what does a publisher want from manufacturers when it comes to sustainability, and has written out her 4 or 5 points, and I think Matt even has access to that, and he's working on that with the project.
She was at our conference in Atlanta in May, yep.
So I do think there are kind of some, if you want to call them low-hanging fruit things, that's a very environmental thing to say, that could happen, but it really needs to be pushed up through the manufacturers. The publishers can only say that they want to do it, and then all of that, obviously the infrastructure needs to be built at that space. And I'll just say, I don't know enough about where the issues lie beyond cost concerns, which is the biggest one that has been vocalized, to say why we haven't really moved that needle further. I think we want it, but we can only want it, and I think this room has to actually actualize it.
Louis, what are you seeing on that front?
So for AAP members, what we've done, I guess, over the last year and a half is really survey our members as to what each company is doing. And it is a matter of resource. So as Brian's an example of a large company that is doing what it can in terms of understanding its own impact on the environment. So as he mentioned, scope 1 and 2, many AAP members are at that stage, certainly the larger ones, where they're looking at their practices, both as a company and of course externally, of how they're impacting the environment. For many of the smaller publishers, it is, again, a resource question. You obviously want to do the right thing, but in terms of what resources you can devote to that, that's one question. And then, of course, the other question is, how much of an understanding does that company have? Because if you start talking about scope 1, 2, and 3, and 4, what does that mean? And then how do you measure your carbon footprint? So our hope at AAP is that we will eventually harness all the information that's out there in terms of what each company is doing and what each company would like to do, because that is the starting point when you have a better understanding of the baselines that you all are driving towards. I think it's certainly the question that was raised earlier about creating the facilities here in the U.S. That's a really good question, because of course when the Section 301 tariffs were put in place, our argument with the government was, this is a big problem. You can't turn it on a dime. You really have to let publishers and printers come to sort of a status where we will be able to meet the demands, but also not impose these burdens or additional burdens on publishers having to pay these extra costs for tariffs. But it did bring to the fore the question of what can we do in the US in terms of printing. And one of the things I learned was it's not all in China. There are certain things that the Chinese do well because they've been doing it for a long time, but much, or at least a lot of the printing is still done here in the US. But if there is increasing demand for print books, and the question of how we meet that capacity, it is, again, a resource question, because as many of you have said, it takes an immense amount of capital to buy the equipment, set up the equipment, and then of course you have the question of, are there workers that will be available if you set up these facilities? And then the last question of demand. Publishers will keep saying, yes, there's plenty of demand, but you, of course, how much do you rely on that? I'm not saying don't rely on it, but it is a question that has to be answered. And I suppose the government could have some role if the government's really interested in bringing back manufacturing. And the Biden administration's mantra is, let's do more for the American worker. But if that is their mantra, what will the government be willing to do in terms of, do they seed this endeavor where, obviously when you talk about subsidies, it's a very difficult question because you have to talk about that in the World Trade Organization space, but maybe there is a role for government in looking at what it can do in terms of bringing together partners so that we can more properly look at this question of what can be done in terms of bringing back manufacturing to the U.S.
Okay. Well, besides what we've talked about, and you guys represent publishers who, of course, aren't members of BMI, but are members of your association. So besides what we've mentioned, what are the key issues that are facing your members today, and how are your associations kind of addressing them? And I don't know who wants to kick off. We talked about a few things, but.
Yeah, I think just generally selling books. I mean, I don't know if that's revolutionary or if that makes It is very difficult when the supply chain is already so saturated with with the big five. So I think for indie publishers, just finding access to consumers, they have become wizards at direct-to-consumer marketing. They're very, very good at it. And I think that big publishers could learn a lot from small presses in the ways in which they can reach their consumers directly. And not just the presses, but the authors themselves. Because indie authors are, again, they just have community in their blood and in their spirit, and they can really work through that space. We don't have direct-to-consumer sales yet. No one's really cracked that. How do we get them to buy from us and not from Amazon once we reach them and they become a convert? But yeah, they really just want to figure out how they can find some space for themselves in this very, very, very crowded market that they've made even more crowded, let's be honest. But the other point I wanted to make, because it did come up in a question too, the diversity, equity, and inclusion belonging issue is something that frustrates indie publishers a lot, because I feel like, and they feel like, and they talk to us a lot about how the reason that they're out there being indie publishers is because they have tried and they would really love to be part of this industry, but they have not found a warmish welcome, or even warm in some cases. And I don't think it's a deliberate thing. I think with like, and the industry has been this New York City-based kind of space. I was joking with my friend about all the memoirs that I was seeing lately that were about a young woman coming to New York City and finding herself like a young white woman. And I'm like, I bet those editors can relate to that moment when they came to New York City. You just kind of gravitate toward things that make sense to you and that are that you can understand. So of course that happens. So when you're not having that diversity, equity, inclusion, and gosh, am I going to forget Michael's name? Who was just talking from HarperCollins?
Ryan Murray.
That's right. I knew that for sure. I knew that. But what he was talking about, it is very white and it's very female. It's very white for sure. It is very female, but it's not very female at the high levels in the publishing industry space. So we have to contend with all of that. So indie publishing has exploded with diversity, equity, and inclusion, while the industry itself and the trade channels have continued to stay narrow to them and has not allowed them in. It's like the channels are just waiting for the big publishers to figure it out, and now we'll have diverse content when it's already figured out. Like there's tons of people with their own voice talking their own stories and getting that content through. They're getting it in form. They're not necessarily getting it into the channels as much as they could. So that's definitely something we contended with for a very, very long time, and the conversations are ongoing for indie publishers.
Yeah, Louis?
So my role at AEP is largely a policy role, but also has an enforcement component. So I think when I speak of the challenges, I'm going to mention four. The first is in the copyright policy space. As you all know, copyright is the foundation of the publishing industry. We wouldn't be it without that. Second, as Angela already mentioned, is DEI. That's become an increasingly important issue. It has been for a while, but I think one of the criticisms has been that it is very much an up and down issue. It'll become the issue of the moment for a while, and then somehow it tapers off, and we never get to the point where we've really seeded fundamental change in how we hire and who we hire and whose stories we tell. And then, of course, sustainability, and then going back to enforcement in terms of the rights. In copyright, what we're seeing across the globe is really efforts to weaken the copyright framework. And when I say that, of course, copyright grants the publisher, an author, exclusive rights with respect to how that publisher and author exploits the work. But we're seeing across the world efforts to weaken those protections, granting broad exceptions and limitations. I'll give one example. For instance, in the UK, they recently announced a decision that they were going to create an exception for so-called text and data mining for any purpose. So that basically means all books, all works, even songs and movies would become part of any company's database, and they can choose to exploit that as they will. So for instance, if you as, let's say a technology company like Google, which already has the entire, well, not the entire, but millions of books already scanned, they, because they have legal access to that, can text and data mine everything that it has. And say they come up with an application that results in something commercial that Google profits from. Publishers should have had, obviously, and authors compensated for the work that was in that database. But that's already a foregone conclusion that they wouldn't be. So if the UK did adopt this proposal, you could have it's just an easier example, for instance, in the music world, where they harvested all music available on the internet, and then you have this program that you can essentially tell to create a song in the style of Justin Bieber. So then Justin Bieber loses out on his work because you have this machine churning out works so similar to him that you're robbing him of his ability, but then also others that might be part of that chain. So we are very concerned about these efforts to weaken the copyright framework, because of course that does affect the ability of an author and publisher to continue to invest in the creation as well as, and of course, in the publishing endeavor. And then we have, in the enforcement side, we have frameworks that are so weak that you as a publisher can no longer actively and or effectively enforce your rights in a digital space. So that is one of our other concerns. And then in the sustainability question, it's not just about the environment. I think if you look at it from the sustainability and the DEI space, part of the sustainability question does have to address the DEI implications, because how do you sustain an industry when, frankly, you're not telling stories of everyone that's in the room? Because we, of course, we all have different stories, but I think, as Angela alluded to, part of the problem is if those people searching for the stories are all white, then they're going to look for experiences that are familiar and that resonate with them. So we do have to bring in more perspectives in the editorial room, in the marketing rooms, because when you bring in those perspectives, they're going to look for the stories that resonate with them. So as a brown person, stories told from that perspective will matter to me. But if I'm not in the room that is actively looking for those stories won't get told. So I don't think these issues are independent of each other. I think they do have to be addressed eventually together, but it is a very difficult, I can't help but use Brian's words, it's a journey for all of us. So how do we get to the point where it all starts to make proper sense, but getting there will be very difficult, because it is going to be a resource question, not just intellectually, but also, of course, financially.
Okay. Well, because I wasn't smart enough, I left the handheld mic for questions in the back. So I'm going to walk and go with the handheld mic. So think of your questions for these lovely ladies.
You in the world.
So thank you, guys. But they covered a bunch of stuff, but I'm sure somebody's got questions for, yep.
So going back to the comments about K-12 education and the shift, if you will, to an individual's desire for certain content to be in the classroom versus a more universal curriculum. The numbers of books printed were often driven by which state determined which curriculum, right? Do you see this dissolution of curriculum driving toward a more customized content for different regions, different states, rather than all of us learning what Florida wanted to learn or all of us learning what Texas wanted to learn, particularly with some of those states going in a very specific direction? Might some of the K-12 production become shorter runs as opposed to the large runs that were dictated by the certain states' curriculums?
That's a really hard question.
That's a great question, I thought. That was a great
It's a
question.
good. I don't think so. I think there is still, I hate to use these terms, there is still the Common Core, which apparently each state is renaming but is retaining the core of the requirement. So at the end of the day, I think the fundamentals, I hope, won't change, because one would think math is math and science is science, one hopes. Of course, obviously the science question is a little bit more difficult if you start talking about the fundamental creator or something like that. But so I don't think so. I think we will retain the core, the fundamentals, but I know publishers, and certainly when the Florida issue came up, there were many reports about certain books supposedly containing too much let's say, accommodations for different points of view, but I don't think it changed the nature of the problems in the sense of the questions being asked of the students. So the short answer is I don't think so. I think there will still be consistency across the board, but it may depend on how persistent a state is with respect to how specific it might be with respect to certain requirements. But bottom line, I hope not. I mean, it certainly would make publishers' job far more difficult. And yours, I guess, right?
For sure. Anybody else? Oh, yeah, Bill.
That was a great question.
Thank you. Hi, Angela. I'm wondering, does IBPA facilitate connections at all or try to between your membership and potential vendors or partners?
We do try to do that. I think in our conference, for sure, it is filled with printers. So I know I talked a lot about Ingram because, I mean, we have to be real about where a lot of that business is going, and what a lot of our members are talking to us about is what's happening through the POD, through that platform. But there are a lot of printers that come through the space, and there's a lot of work that can happen there. So yes, we do try to facilitate that as best we can.
And IBPA has been a great partner for us, obviously with Book Manufacturing Mastered, but they've also pushed out our BMI Source RFQ tool that we have on our website as a place for IBPA members to go to look for extra printing. So definitely. Anybody else? All right, well, the one thing I'm going to say before we close off, because it was in that last question about K-12, and I realized I didn't have it in my update this afternoon, but I had two people ask me during the break, so I figure it's worthwhile. For those of you who don't know, BMI kind of administers, along with AAP and SIMRA, the MSST, which is the textbook spec. And that has been a source of issue lately because people can't get the materials through supply chain to meet the spec. And it doesn't look like that's going to get any easier. So that group is currently looking at potential updates to that spec to make it easier to meet in today's current supply chain climate, but also still adhere to what the publishers want, as well as the durability of the books is what the states want. So stay tuned. The group just had a call last week. They are working through that. So those of you who deal with the MSST at all can expect some updates in 2023. But that will, have some effect on, if states don't want to do 7 or 9 year adoptions and they're starting to shrink that, that'll be better for the spec in terms of what it can handle. So just adding that there. All right, well, thank you very much, Angela and Louis, for your time.